Well, today is all about layers and, well, actually two things, layers and selections. Because if you're working with layers and you don't know how to use selections, you'll be very limited in what you're doing. So that means that we're going to create composites. By a composite, all I mean is something made out of more than one photo. So we're going to composite or combine together more than one photo. We'll also talk about selections and masks. If you've ever heard of a layer mask or quick mask or even something called a channel, we'll get into those. And we'll also talk more about adjustment layers, because yesterday I just kind of hinted at them. I didn't really get into them. And that's the general idea for today. I think you'll enjoy a lot of what we do, because we're also going to end up doing some layouts where, let's say, you don't want to just have a straightforward photo as your end result. Instead, you want something that looks like a greeting card or looks like a wedding invitation or announcement or something like that. You'll learn how to do that where you incorporate your photos, and we'll incorporate your photos in a more interesting way than is oftentimes done, because my wife, Karen, does hand lettering, where she spends a lot of time. She first starts off with a pencil, slowly sketching things out until she gets it exactly the way she wants. Then she inks that by kind of tracing it with an ink pen. And then she scans it, cleans it up, and does all this stuff. And I had her work for multiple days creating graphics for this class, so that if we want to have something like a birth announcement, you can have a hand-lettered thing that says, it's a boy or something like that. And when you put in your photo, instead of it just sitting there and looking like a rectangle, it'll look like somebody drew a hand-lettered or a hand-drawn frame that's containing your picture, so that it has a different feeling than you otherwise would. And so you'll see how we can incorporate some of that. And if you get the class, you get all those hand-lettered pieces coming along with it. So I think it'll be fun. We'll also talk about getting other kind of border treatments on your images. So if you want it to look as if it just doesn't have a crisp rectangular border, instead it's a little more organic, you'll see how to do that. And if you want to, you can add texture to your image as well, so it looks as if it's printed on canvas or anything. So that's some of what we get to look forward to today. But this being a 101 class, we need to slowly ramp you into those features so that you actually understand what you're doing. And so that's what we'll be doing here. I'm going to start off just showing you the difference between working with layers and not working with layers. Because if you're not working with layers, you're extremely limited in what you can do. And what you're doing is more or less permanent to your image. It's very hard to make changes as you progress. Whereas working with layers makes it very easy to make changes. And usually the bottommost layer in any document is the original picture. And so anything you do, as long as it's contained within layers, can be thrown away, and you got your original just sitting there. So you can experiment to your heart's content, never really harming your original picture, because it will be on a separate piece at the bottom of your document, as you'll see. So here I have one of the images from yesterday. Remember when we kind of edited down a folder full of images to figure out which ones are worth editing? Well, I edited one of those images to come up with this. And here I'm in Camera Raw, because that's where we were last kind of talking about adjusting images, and we never really did much from here to get it open in Photoshop. So I just wanted to show in the lower right in Camera Raw, there were 3 buttons. There's Done, Cancel, and Open Image. Remember, cancel means that if you were just experimenting in Camera Raw and whatever you didn't like, and you want to throw away the changes you made the last time you entered Camera Raw. That's what that would do. Done would take the settings that I've applied in Camera Raw and attach them to this raw file as some text called metadata. So the next time I open the picture, it would remember those settings. And then Open Image is the same as clicking Done as far as it's saving the settings on your picture, but it also opens the image all the way into Photoshop, so you can do additional changes there. So I'm going to click Open Image right now. So now we're in Photoshop. In the lower right, you can see my Layers panel. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to collapse down the other things that are on the right side of my screen, just so the Layers panel can take up the most space. And just like when you're in Bridge, you remember that you can double click on the little tabs for each little pane that's in this interface. And if you do, you'll collapse down that to just the tab itself. And I'll do that for some of these areas that I don't need right now, so the Layers panel can be nice and big. Now these little thumbnails that you see, these little preview things you can see, you can control the size of those. And last night I was playing and I made mine really big. That's not the default. Well, let me quickly change this to the default without telling you how, and then I'll show you how to change it. So this is what it would usually look like, and if you look at my layers panel, that's pretty darn small. If we're just going to be talking about a few layers, it might not be a bad thing to have it a larger in my layers panel, just a little easier to see what's going on there. There's a couple different ways of changing how large the thumbnails are that show up in the layers panel, but one method is to move your mouse into an empty area where there are no layers, down here below where the layers show up, and press the right mouse button. Remember, if you only have one mouse button because you're on a Mac that only has one button, holding down the Control key and clicking the mouse is the same as using a right mouse button. If you can plug in a 2-button mouse, and it's just right clicking is the same as control clicking. You know, when I do that, I get this pop-up menu. Now remember, when I right-clicked, I did it within the layers panel in the area below where the layers show up, like where more layers would show up if you had them. And I just pressed the right mouse button there, and I could change the size of them. If you want to mess with a coworker, it's lunchtime, you're going to sneak in there, set it to no thumbnails. It will mess them up. A lot of people don't know that's possible of doing that. Otherwise, I'm going to set mine to large. And that's not a necessary step. It's just going to make it easier for you guys to see so you don't have to squint so much. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to duplicate this image. So we have 2 versions of it, and I'm going to try to do the same process on both versions. One of them I'll use layers with, the other one I'll try not to. And you'll just see where not using layers makes it so it's not very flexible at all, whereas using layers makes things much more flexible. So in order to duplicate this image, I'll go to the image menu, and that's about halfway down I'll find a choice called duplicate. It just means make a second document that looks exactly like this one. When I do that, it asks me to name it, and I'll just call it layers. So that if you ever look at the little tab that's at the top of the document, you could tell which document I'm working on. You see up here it says layers, so you see that's the version I'm using layers in. But the problem is right now we have 2 tabs of identical documents within one window. We can't see them both at the same time. So I will then go to the window menu, and there's a choice called arrange, which means arrange these documents on my screen somehow. And one of the choices here is to kind of tile these 2 up. And if I choose that, watch what happens. There, it made it now so I can see both documents, one above the other. So it just arranged them for me. And all I'm going to do is zoom out so that I can see the entire document on each, because right now it's partially cut off. And I'll do that by typing Command minus. There's Command plus and Command minus. That's Control plus and Control minus in Windows. I mentioned yesterday is just something I use to zoom in and zoom out on your document. And that's what I'm using. I'm going to click on the other tab that's down here at the bottom to make it active. And I'll do the same thing, just so we can see both documents. And so I'll be switching back and forth between these 2. And the way I'll switch is I'll just click on the name of the tab that contains the document. And you'll see the text within that tab turns white to tell you that this is the one I'm working on. And the other one's kind of gray. So if I click back and forth, I can do that. And I'm not going to make a pretty picture right now. I'm just going to do some stuff to this picture. So the first thing I'm going to do is, let's say I don't want the edge of the image to look like a rectangle. Instead, I want it to have a soft edge on it that has more of a random appearance to it, not just a straight soft edge. One way I could accomplish that is to grab the brush tool on the left side of my screen. And whenever you use the brush tool, down at the bottom left of your screen, you have your foreground color. That's the color you would start painting with if you moved your mouse on top of the image, clicked and dragged. So right now I'd get gray. I'd like to have white, because if I print on a white sheet of paper, wherever I paint with white, it'll look as if it's fading out to the sheet of paper. So I'm going to click on my foreground color, which will bring up a color picker, and within this big rectangle, I'll drag to the upper left corner, which is where white is. Click OK so that that's white. Then I want to use a soft brush, so we don't get a crisp edge in the edge of the photo. Instead, it's a soft one. So at the top of my screen, remember the options bar that's horizontal, expands the top of my screen? Those are all the settings for the brush I'm about to use. Whoops, if I didn't type a weird key. And one of the things up there is my brush. If I look where it shows me a preview of my brush, it's right here. The number that's underneath it represents how large the brush is, but I find it more useful to just move my mouse on top of the image to see it. And I can change the size of the brush in a couple different ways. One method is to come up here and click within this area. And here we have a size setting and a hardness setting for how hard or soft the edge is and how big it is. So this is one way of doing it, but to be honest, I absolutely never come up here to change it this way. This is like the old way of doing it, back before there were other methods that were more efficient. But if you ever forget some method that might involve your keyboard or something else because you just don't remember the keyboard shortcuts, you can always come up here, click within that little preview near the upper left of your screen, and change the size or hardness. There are a bunch of different ways of changing our brush. A way that you've been able to do it for a very long time, meaning for a decade or so, is you could use the square bracket keys on your keyboard. They look like half squares, so they're right above the return or enter key on your keyboard. And if you press that, the right one will give you a larger brush, the left one will give you a smaller brush. And you can see the number changing in the upper left of my screen. I don't know if you can see it because it's pretty tiny, but this number, which is the size of my brush, when I use those, you can see it changing. The other thing is you can change how hard the edge of your brush is by adding the Shift key. If you hold down Shift and then do the right arrow key, or not arrow key, bracket key, or left bracket key, you're going to be changing how soft or hard the edge of the brush is. And you can also see that if you stare at that little preview. I'll do it now, Shift, right bracket, Shift, left bracket. You see it getting softer edged versus harder edged. And there are other methods as well for doing the same thing. But for now, I'm going to use that because it's just what I'm used to. And I want a soft edge brush that is relatively large. All right, I'm just going to start painting on my image, trying to put white on the edge, knowing that if I print it on a sheet of white paper, that's where it'll blend into the white paper, wherever we get white in the document. So I'm going to come over here, and I'm just going to paint to get kind of a random soft edge instead of a straight one. And when I do that, if you look in the Layers panel, everything is in one piece. It's on what's called the background. There's that white stuff that I put on is not separate from the original image. Then I'm going to click on the image that's above. And that one we're going to use Layers on instead. So before I make any change to the image, I need to create a new layer. So I'll go to the bottom of my Layers panel, and down there I got a bunch of icons. One of them is supposed to look like a sheet of paper with a corner turned up. That's the new layer icon. And if you need to know what any of these layers are called or any of these icons are called, just hover over them without clicking, and you should see a tooltip show up to tell you what does this icon represent. So create new layer. So I'm going to click that, and now we have this new empty layer. Anytime you see a checkerboard in Photoshop that looks like this checkerboard, it means that that thing is empty, whatever it is. It means it doesn't contain white, it doesn't contain gray, it contains nothingness. It's completely empty. So in reality though, this is like taking a sheet of glass that's perfectly clean and has a anti-reflection coating on it and just sliding it over your picture so that whatever you're about to do is going to be isolated from the picture itself. Instead, it's contained on this big sheet of glass that's sitting over your image. So now with that active, I'll grab my brush and I'll paint around the edge again. And now if you look in the Layers panel, you can see the original picture is untouched underneath, hasn't been changed at all. And on top of it is the equivalent to a big sheet of glass, and that's where my paint got deposited. It's on the sheet of glass. And it's always as if we're standing at the top of the Layers panel looking down. And so in order to see the image that's at the bottom of the Layers panel, we're looking through that sheet of glass at it. And it's obstructing our view of what's underneath. Make sense? That's the essence of what a layer is. Now let's go to the image at the bottom where we're not using layers. Now I really wish when I painted that I got a little more random of an edge. And so I want to do something to make the edge more random. And I'm going to do that by applying a filter or two. I'm going to come down and there's a filter under the submenu called Distort that is called Ripple. And it's just going to ripple whatever is active. Right now what's active is the layer called background. So everything in that layer is going to get rippled. So I choose Ripple. I get a preview of part of my image in here. I can see the person in here. I can actually click and drag within this preview, and I might get up here to where I can see that transition to the white edge. And I'm just going to bring the amount up higher and higher until I can start to see some sort of change there. At the bottom, I can choose the size of my rippling. If I choose large, I might start getting a more dramatic change there. And I'll just click OK. So what have I done? I went to the filter menu. Under the submenu called Distort, I found something called Ripple. I'm doing a large ripple with the amount turned way up. Click OK. Well, the problem is, if you look at the photo at the bottom and I zoom up on it, the ripple filter applied to whatever was active. And if you look in the Layers panel, you can see what's active. It's everything we have. And so not only did the edge that I paint in get rippled, but so did the photo itself. Now let's do the same thing on the image above. On the image above, we have that paint that we put in on a separate piece, a separate layer, that is independent of the one that's underneath. And whenever we apply a filter can only affect one layer at a time. And so we just make sure the layer we want to affect is active. And because that's the only thing that's active, this that's underneath is going to be unchanged. So now I'll just come over here and apply the same ripple filter. And it should remember the settings, the last ones I used. Here I see a checkerboard because it is right now previewing the center of the document. And if you look in the Layers panel, the center of this particular layer is empty. But if I actually clicked within this preview and dragged far enough, I'd eventually get near the edge of the document and I should see my white paint that's in there. Okay? And I'll click OK and just apply that. Now if I zoom up on that image, and I might have needed to use a higher setting to make it more obvious, but can you see some sort of change that's happened where the white stuff is? If I choose Undo, I'll do that by using the keyboard shortcut for Undo. Most people are used to the keyboard shortcut for Undo because you screw up in every program you use. I do at least. So Command-Z, Control-Z in Windows. I'll type. And if you type it a second time, it simply reapplies whatever you undid. So you can see that I've done that. Then I might want to come in here and get a different look on the picture itself, the main picture of the horse. But this is a change that I might not want to have happen to the entire part of it, or I might want to easily get rid of part of it and return that image looking to normal. So what I'm going to do this time is I'm going to click on the background layer and I'm going to duplicate it. There are many different ways of duplicating a layer. One method of duplicating is to drag a layer to the new layer icon. Because remember we clicked on the new layer icon to get an empty layer? Well, if you drag something on top of it, you're saying give me a new layer, but make it out of this, the thing I'm dragging. So there's my duplicate. And now I'm going to come over here and let's try blurring it. I'm going to use a kind of blur that's called a radial blur. And I can either spin or zoom. We'll try zooming. Click OK. And see what we get. Can you see the kind of look we have? I'll do the same thing to the image below that's not using layers. Exact same settings, just click OK. Now, because the image at the bottom is made out of one layer, anytime you apply a filter, it ends up affecting the entire layer. And so I can't somehow magically bring this back. I can't make that not affect the border effect that we have there. There's all sorts of things that I can't do to this one. Now there are some things though that I can do as long as I haven't closed the document yet. As long as you haven't closed the document yet, you always have undo, and you actually have more than one undo. If you go to the window menu, there's a choice in here called history, and it'll list everything you've done to this picture. And so it tells me I opened the picture, I used the brush tool to paint that border around it, and then I applied the ripple and radial blur filters. And if I click on one of these previous steps, it's equivalent to me undoing that. And I can go all the way back to the original picture. The other thing about using this thing called the history panel is there's a little icon over here. Do you see that guy? That's the history brush icon. And if you see that and you actually look over in your tool panel, I actually have to remember where it is. I think it might be under the brush. It'll actually take me a minute to find it. Oh, it's right there. Because I never use it. And I mean never, ever, ever. Because I use layers instead. But in the brushes panel, you'll see the exact same icon in there. It's just above the eraser. That's the history brush. What the history brush means is we can paint with whatever my picture looked like at any one of these previous stages. And the default setting for what we would paint with is the original picture. But if we wanted to paint with what it looked like at any of these other stages, we would just click on one of these spots to say, I want to paint with what it looked like at this point. So if that's up there at the top, we could use this thing called the history brush, and I could come in and paint. And if I did, I could bring back what the original picture looked like, because it's painting with what the document used to look like at a previous stage. That's what the history brush does. It has it in this history panel. There's a little brush to say, what version do you want to paint with? I want to paint with the version that had all these things applied right there, where we were a few minutes ago. And now I could paint it back in. Sounds great, but the problem is, if you were to save this image and close it, the next time you open it, that history list would be cleared out, because that history list only contains so many steps. It's not going to, like if you do 5,000 steps to your image, you're not going to have every of them listed. Depending on the version of Photoshop you have, it's going to have between 20 and 50 steps that it remembers. And you could always get back to what it looked like at a previous state. But the moment you close your document and you open it up again, this would not have a list in it. It would just show, it would have the word open. All you've done is open your image. And so if I save and close the image at the bottom, I'd no longer have the ability to get back to any of these previous stages. But if I use layers, it's different. Because with layers, we're keeping all the parts that make up our picture. Within the layers panel itself, we have the original picture down here at the bottom. Above it, we have a version that had that weird blur filter applied to it. And above that, we have the white paint that we put in. And they're physically separate pieces. If we save the image, we're saving these pieces. And when we open it again, we have the exact same pieces there, and we can easily make changes to them. Whereas the version at the bottom, if I click on it, this is all it's going to save right there. Everything is permanently applied. So with the image at the top, there's a lot of stuff I could do. Let's say I want to change what color that edge is that I painted around. I didn't want to use white. I want to use something else. Well, I click on my foreground color and I change it. Let's say I wanted black. So I choose black. Now I would like to change the color that's in this layer. Well, I can do that by going to the Edit menu and saying that I'd like to fill. So if I choose fill, one of the choices that I get in this dialog box is to fill with my foreground color. My foreground color is the color that I have right here, black. What if I just click OK? It fills everything, because I didn't tell it not to. It just said, OK, fine, you told me to fill. I'll choose undo, and I'll try it one more time, Edit, Fill. There's a checkbox here called Preserve Transparency. That means preserve the empty parts of this layer. That means if you look in the Layers panel, any part of the layers of this particular layer that looks like a checkerboard is not going to change. So if I turn on that checkbox and now I click OK, I can easily change the color that I'd put in the edge, because it preserved the empty parts of the layer, filled everything else. If I switch to the image below, how can I do that? Because there's nothing here to help me. There's nothing that says where is that white stuff. It's not separate from the image itself. I could attempt to make what's called a selection to isolate that area, but creating a selection that's in this shape with this soft of an edge to get it to match, and even if I did and I filled it, you'd still have it blending into the color that's here. You just wouldn't be able to do it. And so doing it with layers makes it much more versatile. And that's how we're going to work. We're going to just do a bunch of stuff with layers today. But just in case you'd never used layers and didn't make any sense to you yet, you can just hopefully see at this stage that it helps to keep these pieces separate from each other. But anytime you think about the layers panel, imagine you're standing at the top looking down, and you simply need to look through the top layer to see what's below it. And so what's in the top layer might obscure your view of what's underneath. And then let's talk about saving our images. I'm going to save the image that's at the top. I'll just go to the File menu and choose Save As. Only certain file formats support layers. And if you look down here in the Save As dialog box, I just went to the File menu and choose Save As to get here, there's a checkbox called Layers. If I were to turn that off when I save my image, when I were to open it in the future, there'd only be one layer. It'd be called background, and it'd be as if this stuff was permanently combined together, kind of like the image that was at the bottom. So I want to make sure that stays on. And if I switch between various file formats, you'll find that some file formats don't support layers. And because they don't support layers, that little checkbox will be grayed out. There'll be a warning triangle next to it to indicate you're going to lose these layers. You'll still get the same looking end result. It's just going to merge them together as if they were permanently combined. And so there are only certain file formats that allow that checkbox to be turned on. The main ones that people use are Photoshop and tiff. With both of those file formats, it does not degrade the quality of your picture at all, meaning you can save into that file format and reopen your image as many times as you want, and you always get exactly what you had at the time that you saved your image when you open it again. The main file format people are used to using that doesn't support layers is JPEG. So we're not going to be saving these as JPEG files. I think of JPEG as being a final file format, not what I would call a working file format. Because the JPEG file format, every time you save, it tries to save space. And it does that by compressing your image in a way that throws away a little bit of information. And so I usually only want to use JPEG at the end, because I only want it to throw away a little bit of information when I'm done. If I use it as a working file format, where I save my image, close it, and then open it the next day, the version I open the next day is slightly lower quality than the one I had the day before. Make additional changes to it, save it, close it, open it the next day. It's slightly lower quality again, because each time it compressed it. And any time it compresses it, it's throwing away information. It's what's called lossy compression. Both Photoshop and tiff will also compress your image a little bit. It'll make it smaller. But it's not going to be anywhere near as small as JPEG, because both Photoshop and tiff does not degrade the quality of your picture at all. And because of that, because it can't throw anything away, it can't be as efficient with making the image smaller in file size. But those are the two best working file formats, Photoshop and tiff. And you could flip a coin to pick between the two. It doesn't really matter. But there are a couple advantages of tiff that are more recent developments. First off, the tiff file format can save larger pictures. If you ever stitch a panorama that is ridiculously big, and I do mean ridiculously big, it's made out of, 40 pictures, not 5, 40. It might find that if you save it in Photoshop file format, especially if it kept all the layers it was made out of, that it might say this is too big for the Photoshop file format. And if so, you can switch to tiff, because it can handle a larger image. There are some other advantages of tiff that I don't want to get into right now, but just know I'm going to use tiff right now. It's what I've been standardizing on. But if you're used to using Photoshop file format, don't feel bad. There's no problem as long as your files don't get too big. You could flip a coin to pick between them. Okay? So I'll click Save. This comes up with options for my tiff file. You could just ignore it all and click OK to just say use default settings. The main thing you want to be careful of is right here. Layer compression, there's a choice called discard layers. That would combine your layers together, just like that layers checkbox that was in the save dialog box. It would mean don't save the layers, combine them together into one piece. So the main thing is I don't want to choose that. So I'll click OK, and it warns me, hey, saving layers is going to increase the file size. I just choose don't show, choose again. or don't show again, because I'm going to be saving layers and TIFF files all the time. I don't want to be warned. So the main thing we learned so far is layers are nice because it saves the pieces that this is made out of, and we need to use certain file formats to support layers. If you ever see that the layers checkbox is grayed out, it means that file format didn't support layers, so you need to switch to something else. And it's Photoshop file format and TIFF that are the two main ones for using layers, and you can just pick between the two. It doesn't really matter, but TIFF does have a couple advantages, and that's the only reason I'm choosing it. So now we're going to start doing projects with layers. And as I do projects with layers, I'll just introduce you to more and more features slowly with layers to get you more comfortable with them. And by the end of the day, we'll be doing some pretty sophisticated stuff with layers. We got to start somewhere. And some people that are watching the class have never used layers. And you're like, what is a layer? And so I had to start somewhere. Okay? Before we move on to that, any questions by chance? Because usually I close these documents, and the moment I do, boom, a question comes up about them. So yeah.
As far as saving in TIFF versus PSD, sometimes you don't, if you're sharing work, like you're both working on something, you don't know which version of PSD they're working with. Is it better to do TIFF? I mean, if they're doing, say, CS5 or something, and you have, you're working at the more...
The only thing there relating to that would be is if you're using features in Photoshop that are not available in that previous version. For instance, there's something called a smart object, and if you used one of those and they're using a version of Photoshop before smart objects were introduced, then there's something in that file that version of Photoshop doesn't know what it is, smart object, and therefore it doesn't matter if you use Photoshop or TIFF, it's still not going to understand that part because you used some technology that didn't exist in their version. Does that make sense? But it doesn't matter if you use Photoshop file format or TIFF, it's that you used a feature that doesn't exist in their version. There are things you can do. There's something called rasterizing a layer. Rasterizing means turning it into just a picture. It's no longer using that special feature called a smart object. It's like you permanently converted it to a normal layer, and then they'd be able to open it. But it doesn't have to do with the actual file format you used so much. It's more, am I using a feature that didn't exist in their version? And if so, is there a way I can create the same effect without using that feature? Or make that feature permanent so that it's no longer changeable, but it still looks the same. But it wouldn't really influence which one of those file formats I used. No? Yeah?
Yeah, when you said TIFF has an advantage of being able to save larger files,
Yeah.
Are you talking about number of layers? Are you talking about
number of megabytes?
History panel, or are you talking megabytes?
Megabytes.
And what is
or
the,
gigabytes.
or gigabytes. What is the...
I can't remember off the top of my head. If you Google it, it might be that the Photoshop file format supports, it's either 2 or 4 gigabytes or something like that, and if you need to go higher than that, TIFF file format can go higher. There's also a limit on TIFF file format, and if you run into that, you need to go to another file format called PSB, which is Photoshop Big file format, and that can handle just about anything, but is not compatible with too many other programs, and that's why we only use PSB when we have to. Yeah, but if you want to see what PSB is, if I choose Save As, there's a choice here just called Large Document Format. That's called a PSB file. That one can save the biggest, most number of megabytes or gigabytes in size. And you'll find out if you run into it. I have images where I just have an image that might be made out of 100 photographs. Full resolution photographs. And that's what the raw material is made out of. And the file size is just so big that when I try to save in Photoshop file format, it tries, you see a progress bar and everything, and then it goes bink, and it brings up a warning saying, hey, we couldn't do that. It's beyond the maximum size of a Photoshop file format. So I do Save As again, I try TIFF, most of the time it works. And on a rare instance, very rare, I doubt anybody is going to run into it, it would say, hey, it's even too big for a TIFF. And that's when I would go to large document format, because that's the ultimate. If it can't fit in that, it can't be saved. Yeah. So, but I'm talking really huge files that most people wouldn't run into.